Welcome everyone to the Prepared for Environmental Change webinar series, which is hosted by Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. My name is Andrea Webster, and I'm happy to serve as your webinar moderator in the background. I'm not actually the webinar moderator, but I'll handle the logistics today. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this webinar from Indiana University, which is a place that is built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. Our webinar today will focus on energy burden and how much of the household income pays for heating, cooling, and transportation. All webinar attendees are muted as normal. Please enter your questions into the chat function, which you can access by hovering your mouse over the Zoom window. We are recording today's webinar, and I'll share a link to that recording along with follow-up resources with all registrants early next week so that you can share what you've learned with your colleagues and peers. And now I'm very happy to introduce to you Janet McCabe, who is the director of the Environmental Resilience Institute, who will serve as our moderator.
Well, hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today in our November webinar of our webinar series. To have you. I see some people I recognize who have joined us and names that I don't know. So it's always great to have new people join us. The topic that we're covering today is an incredibly important one. We all know that energy bills can be a major financial burden for some families, especially, and that there are things that utility companies and local governments and community organizations often do to try to help. So we're really excited to talk about those ideas today with our guests. And I'll just say that in this time of thinking about climate change and what that means for people's energy bills, what's happening in the utility industry, what's going on with the pandemic where we're all at home more, these issues are just ever more present. And it's great that we have folks like our three guests today who are working on these issues. So I'm very excited to have our three guests, Carla Walker, Savannah Sullivan, and Trevor Memmott with us today. They're going to provide you with context, with program opportunities, with ideas, with financial models. Hopefully these will inspire you to learn more about this and maybe even take action in your own community. Let me start by noting that the webinar is hosted by the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute. We have a number of resources that we develop specifically with local governments in mind, but all of our resources are available to any member of the public that wants to take a look at them and would find them useful. I'll do a special plug for In This Climate, our very fun podcast. I'm sure you're all just really looking for that additional podcast to add to your life. But this is, we've got a lot of material on there, especially recently. We've posted a lot of things. We're trying to have shorter segments so that they're easy to listen to. It's a whole range of interesting speakers from inside and outside, mostly outside the university, on topics that relate to climate change here and around the world. So please take a listen and do look at our other resources as well. Including this webinar series. And we're always looking for ideas for webinar topics too, if you have any of those. Another really important resource that I want to point out to you that I don't think I'm being disloyal to IU by mentioning it. It is not an IU product, but it's called the Sustainable Development Code. It is an amazing collection of examples of good, better, and best local government ordinances, rules, policies around all aspects of sustainability. And it's organized in a really good way. It's just excellent. It's got contributors from all across the country. It's a work continually in progress. So check that out if you're looking for resources that you don't find on the Environmental Resilience Institute website. I want to thank our co-hosts, Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, Association of Indiana Counties, Health by Design and the Indiana Public Health Association. We really appreciate the fact that they are interested in making sure their members know about the topics that we present in this webinar series. So thanks very much to them. And thanks to all of you for joining today. We always love to see who has signed up from local governments and others, and have the word spread. So thanks to you all. Please do, if you find this webinar to be interesting, feel free to tell your friends and relations and coworkers that they might want to catch one next time. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to Trevor, who's going to go first, and then he will seamlessly transfer over to Savannah and Carla. So you won't hear from me again until the end. So let me start going from left to right on the slide here. Carla Walker is the climate advisor for the city of Cincinnati. She develops and implements strategies that accelerate that city's climate goals. As a participant in the American City Climate Challenge, Cincinnati is really doing a lot of great work in this area. Throughout her career, she's spearheaded large-scale civic engagement and public service initiatives at the local, state, national, and international levels. She's worked with 3 Cincinnati mayors. We know how challenging that is. And therefore her fingerprints are on many of the major projects that define the city's renaissance, from the banks and riverfront development to neighborhood revitalization, and Cincinnati's notable environmental initiatives and climate change plans. Really, we look to them a lot. She leads and manages many of the city's equity initiatives, really important for our topic today, as they relate to energy and climate. She has a BS from the University of Cincinnati, a master's in environmental engineering science from the University of Florida, and a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. So we're really thrilled to have her with us today and doing the work she's doing in Cincinnati. Savannah Sullivan is a member of the ERI family. I'll just say that right out front. She has worked with us when she was in graduate school here at IU, and we were sorry to lose her, but thrilled to find her land in the Climate and Community Resilience Office at the City of Cincinnati. She's currently co-leading the development of 2 low-income energy efficiency programs for multifamily buildings. This is a real challenge in the energy efficiency world, is how to bring those benefits to low-income people or people who live in multifamily buildings. She's leading the city's projects for the National League of Cities 2020 Resilience Cohort and the 2020 NOAA Urban Heat Island Community Science Campaign, all things that are really interesting. She did receive her MPA and MS from our own IU O'Neill School for Public and Environmental Affairs and a BA from Oberlin College. So we're thrilled to see Savannah back again. If you work at ERI, you should just assume that you'll be invited to speak on a webinar at some point in the future for all of you grad students that are listening today. Our third speaker is Trevor Memmott. He's a second-year PhD student at O'Neill. He studies environmental and energy policy. His primary research interests include the energy transition, public opinion, and environmental justice. His current work focuses on public attitudes and activism towards the new energy infrastructure and energy insecurity among low-income households. He has a bachelor's degree in political science and an MPA from the University of Idaho, and he worked as an administrative assistant at the city of Moscow, which I established is Moscow, Idaho, not some other Moscow that you might be thinking about. And he was an adjunct professor at Washington State University and the University of Idaho. So I can't imagine a better panel, a more practical panel on this topic. And with that, I will turn it over to Trevor to share his slides and get us started.
Okay, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. Let's see if I can get this. Hopefully everyone can see that. So I'm going to sort of give a broad overview to energy insecurity in the United States. This is what I've been studying. And obviously, as the presentation goes on, this will get more particular in terms of how cities can deal with this in terms of Savannah and Carla's work. But our survey deals with what's happening across the United States as a representative sample of low income households. So we're studying socioeconomic disparities, which groups are the most affected and how are they affected, right? So there is a range of things that we discuss when we talk about energy insecurity, in terms of going from not being able to pay your energy bill, or maybe only paying your energy bill every other month, payment plans, things like this, in terms of struggling to pay, and then reaching all the way to the most severe form, which is being disconnected from your service, which is unfortunately extremely prevalent in the United States. Our research also is taking place during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are doing a multi-wave survey that will track families across the length of the pandemic, or hopefully the length of the pandemic if it ends at some point. But we also track what happened before the pandemic. So we're able to sort of have a comparison point of what was the condition of families before the pandemic, and then how did the pandemic affect households individually over the course of the pandemic. So first, to start out with defining energy insecurity. Very simply, energy insecurity is defined as an inability to meet one's household energy demands. This has a range of different elements to it. Again, it ranges from not being able to pay your bill or having struggles paying your bill to being disconnected, but there's all kinds of things in between that. There are economic, behavioral, and physical components in terms of, clearly there are going to be economic outcomes if you are somebody who is not able to pay your bill. But we also see behavioral changes among families who are struggling to pay their bills. So one thing that we've looked at is coping strategies. And so, for example, we see some families use their oven as their heating source because they have, broken equipment in their house that they can't adequately heat their house. So there's all kinds of activities and behavior taken on in order to sort of meet energy demands that increases risk and increases vulnerability. So this can kind of have a confounding effect where not only do you have the initial side effects that come along with just energy insecurity in itself, but the ways that you try to cope with energy insecurity can also lead to some pretty severe outcomes. And then one of the main focuses of our studies is intersection with health insecurity. We know that there are huge health consequences to being energy insecure. This is especially prevalent among children. There's been a lot of work on what happens to children as they are energy insecure. And as you might suspect, the health outcomes can be pretty dramatic. So it's important to keep in mind not just energy insecurity as sort of a silo and a thing in and of itself, but how it has the effect on all these other aspects, again, economic, behavioral, and physical. Here's a clip from a headline of a New Jersey woman who was on oxygen dying after being shut off by our power company. These are the kind of stories that are happening across America, and these are things that happen in normal times, and that these sort of inequities that lead to these kind of decisions are being made worse by the COVID pandemic and its impact on the economy. So in the background of all of this, what leads to energy insecurity is the demand for energy and the amount of cost, the amount of expenses that people incur trying to pay energy. So we've seen energy demand up over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, particularly. So we just see increasing energy demand overall, regardless of the pandemic and the current shocks that we're seeing. But it shot up in the early months of the pandemic because people were at home more, right? So if your state's on a lockdown and you're at home, those hours that you normally spend at work, not using your own residential energy, you're now spending, in front of a computer, as I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. We have a lot of really striking research that we don't know the cause to, but it shows that minorities on average have a higher energy burden. So minorities, despite making less income, are paying more for their energy bill, even when controlling for income. And this is a huge, huge problem. I think this is one of the areas of scholarship that really needs to be examined, because we simply don't know the cause of why essentially minorities are being charged more for their energy service. So again, we don't have good answers to that, but the evidence of it happening is clear at this point. And then we know that poor housing conditions are a major driver of energy costs. And that's one of the things that we study, right? So if you have things like poor insulation, if you have things that drive up your energy bill, that's going to be a huge driver of cost. So here's just kind of a fun chart to look at energy use during the early months of the pandemic, where you see normally middle of the day energy demand drops because people are at work or people are out of their house. But during the pandemic, people were home, so you actually saw a spike in the middle of the day. So some of the the spike in energy insecurity that we see early in the pandemic is due to staying home and using a lot more energy, and then your bill rises, of course. And here we have a map of state moratoriums. So as some of you may know, as the pandemic was brought on, a lot of states went ahead and said, we're not going to shut anybody's energy off. But unfortunately, this was not federal. This was not ubiquitous. This map's a little bit outdated, but I think it gets the point across, to where you see a bunch of, first of all, there was maybe 9 or 10 states, if I recall correctly, who had just no moratorium whatsoever. They never had a moratorium at any time. And then you have other states who protected people early on. They would be covered for like April and May, and then their moratorium would expire. And then of course you have some states who are protecting people over the length of the pandemic, or at least promising to do so. So you have massive state variability in terms of whether people are protected or not. And obviously from the perspective of somebody who's an advocate for energy security, this is a major problem that we don't have federal rules in place to say that in the midst of a pandemic, when we have these state lockdowns, when we have high unemployment, when people are going to be at home, that we should be willing to protect them from at least being willing to protect them from having their energy shut off in the midst of this crisis. I will just note I'm currently working on a policy paper directly analyzing the direct effects of these moratoriums. And what I've found so far is that one, of course, it had a big effect on who was disconnected and who wasn't. It seemed to have had a big targeting effect where families that were particularly vulnerable, weren't being shut off. But I also have found these massive statistical effects in terms of people being able to afford basic expenses, where because you're protected, you're able to buy food and the things that you need, as opposed to saying, oh, I have a $200 energy bill that if I don't pay, I'm going to get shut off. So we've seen big effects in terms of sort of being able to afford basic needs, kind of consumption smoothing over the course of the pandemic as a result of these orders. So all the evidence we have is that these were very, very important, and they really did provide a lot of security. And so in states where we're running out, there's big cause for concern of what will happen next. This is a whole list of headlines about what's going to happen when these moratoriums expire. We've already seen as soon as moratoriums expire, a bunch of utility companies going in to shut off people pretty quickly. So clearly a big problem across many, many states. We're going to see more and more of these headlines as time goes on. In fact, again, this slide is a little bit outdated. I'm sure there are even to this day a few more headlines about things like this. We see 35 million people losing their utility shutoff protections in a single month. So this is massive swaths of the population who are going from being protected to not protected. And unsurprisingly, again, during an economic crisis, that's going to have really, really big effects. The other thing to add to this is that if we end up at the end of the year where we see the eviction moratorium, and that's a whole nother thing layered on top of this, right? If you're not protected from being evicted or having your utility shut off, that's just clearly deeply concerning. Again, as we're, as we speak, entering, some of the worst times of the pandemic. So, things have not gotten any easier for a lot of people. And so, it kind of seems like that we've tried to move on from the pandemic, but the pandemic hasn't moved on from us. We're still experiencing some of the worst effects. And so these things expiring are deeply concerning. So just briefly to talk about our survey quickly, we're tracking people over the course of a year throughout the pandemic to see, if people are getting worse, if people are getting better, if there's variation. This is a survey of people at or below 200% of the federal poverty line, right? This is the population that we're really concerned with. Obviously, a lot of evidence that low-income people are the ones that experience the worst effects of this energy insecurity. We have a representative sample, and then we collect a bunch of data on people's demographic information, behavioral, again, energy insecurity itself, what's actually happening to them, what kind of government assistance do they get, and the housing conditions they live in. And we have a measure for 12 months before the pandemic, and then we measure each month throughout the pandemic. So we have broadly, we have this measure of what happens during normal times. What was your situation like before the pandemic, and then how is it being affected by the pandemic? So this graph shows insecurity over the course of the last year and the course of the last month. The key thing to note here is that the bars with the stripes indicate what happened in the last month. And so basically what you see here, just from looking at this graph visually, is that about half of insecurity across most of these categories happened in the last month, right? So we're talking about 12 months compared to 1 month. So this gets you an idea of how severe this really was in terms of a single 30-day period basically matching the rest of the entire year. Shows pretty substantially that people were hit pretty hard by the pandemic. This first measure, poor housing stock, has to do with things like broken equipment, with things like mold, with things like having poor insulation. Holes in the wall is another thing that we measured. And as Savannah and Carla will discuss with the multifamily buildings, a lot of this poor housing stock is driven by where you live, right? So we found that people that lived in houses were much more secure than people that lived in apartments, which shouldn't surprise anybody. But a lot of what's driving this insecurity that we see in poor housing stock is where you live and what kind of dwelling you actually live in. This second variable, medical device, we sort of came in not having big expectations about, but we found it to be huge. So if you have a medical device that you power at home, people were not used to powering that in their house, or at least not during all hours of the day. They were used to going to either work or an institution and powering it there. So what we found is massive cost incurred from people having to power medical devices at home. This was far more prevalent than we had expected going in, and clearly it leads to a lot of energy insecurity. And then we have these racial categories, and then families with children under 5 years old is also a huge driver of insecurity. So here are the raw numbers. We use these to extrapolate. So we took our survey and then we just matched them with, what populations are 200% or under 200% of the federal poverty line. And so just to sort of give you a real feel of how serious that we're talking about, in the month of May alone, right, in sort of the first like full serious month of the pandemic, if you look at the bottom rightmost number, 4 million individuals were disconnected in just that month alone, if we extrapolate our data. So we're talking about like very, very serious numbers, right? It's easy to look at these effects and think that we're talking about a limited population, but we're talking about millions and millions of people. So it's really, really quite the effect. This slide is less important, but this is just sort of some direct COVID impacts. So that the variable that says COVID impacts is just a measure of how hard the pandemic hit you, how much you had to alter your life. On the bottom, we see the stimulus check had a pretty substantial effect on energy insecurity, which is really important. And just to clarify, the blue bar is disconnected, the orange bar is receiving a notice, and then the yellow bar is not being able to pay an energy bill. So we said that the stimulus check, that $1,200 stimulus check, had a really big impact for a lot of families. Was very important. These are some aggregate numbers. We're currently analyzing the second wave of the survey. And so we see here, since the pandemic began, so this is from May to August, when we sent out the second wave, 20% of this population has not been able to pay a bill, 15% has received a notice, and 6.5% has been disconnected. So again, really, really substantial numbers just over the course of about 4 months. And not only is insecurity getting worse overall, but disparities are getting worse, right? So if you look at the disconnection rate among white families and then among black families were almost 4 times more likely to be disconnected, and Hispanic families were almost 7 times more likely to be disconnected. So not only as the pandemic goes on, are things getting worse for all people, but the disparities that we saw beforehand are being exacerbated, which is obviously a huge component of this. So just to wrap up, a few important implications. As I just mentioned, increasing racial disparities is going to be a really big deal. This doesn't just go away, right? It's not going to go away in a few months or when this pandemic ends. These are going to last into the future. So these disparities are going to be here to stay for a long period of time. 2, these expiring shutoff moratoriums are a really, really big problem. Obviously, being disconnected is one of the worst things that could happen to you. It's very expensive to get your service turned back on. So I think that we should be, as advocates, pushing for extending those moratoriums everywhere that we can. 3rd, the need for short-term and long-term government assistance. As I just said, the stimulus check was really, really influential on allowing people to manage their energy insecurity. So we need short-term targeted aid to fix some of these problems. But again, as these disparities increase, they're going to last into the future. So even post-pandemic, we need long-term aid that's able to deal with the problem of energy insecurity directly. Fourth is seasonal variation. So we've basically we've surveyed the summer months. Now we're going to head into the winter. So we'll see how much that changes. And then finally, debt accrual. People are racking up a ton of debt and some of the worst kinds of debt to try to pay off their bills and try to stop themselves from being disconnected. So we're going to see these long-term effects on people's economic standing too. So that is all I have, and I will pass it to Savannah and Carla. If I can.
Great, thank you, Trevor. I will just share my screen. There we go. All right. Well, thanks again to ERI for featuring this topic, and thanks, Trevor, for your awesome research. This type of work really empowers local government practitioners to dive deep and deliver on these important issues. Carla and I are so excited to be here, so I will jump right in. Today, we'll be discussing the City of Cincinnati's energy equity programming, which is currently funded through a settlement with Duke Energy Ohio and is for families at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. Carla and I have been working with the Office of Environment and Sustainability the last 18 months to design and launch a suite of initiatives related to energy efficiency for low-income multifamily housing that provides both short and long-term support. For the webinar today, we'll be sharing our strategy development approach, how we've created programs for both renters and building owners, and COVID-19 considerations while doing this work. So when we look at the way climate and energy issues affect cities, it's clear that some communities and vulnerable populations are impacted in disproportionate ways. Trevor outlined clear disparities with respect to energy insecurity. And as we see it, Cincinnati's success or failure in preparing for the impacts of climate change will be measured by how it is able to address the needs of those on the front lines of impacts and those already suffering from a range of challenges, including lack of economic opportunity, racism, and more. Cincinnati's Office of Environment and Sustainability is committed to its work being built on three central pillars: sustainability, equity, and resilience. In the strategic development of the energy equity programs, we were committed to attending to the three tenets of equity and justice. First, that it is crucial to recognize, identify, and acknowledge injustices affecting specific populations. Not only did we research local housing history and confer with a wide range of local partners engaged directly on these issues, we worked with the University of Cincinnati to conduct an assessment of the multifamily housing stock, building age, typology, et cetera, as well as the state of energy burden at the census block level. To the right here is a map from that study, identifying areas with the highest energy burden in Cincinnati. And we have a series of maps pertaining to, like I said, building age, typology, as well as, demographics, income, et cetera. And the report can be found on our website. It was also key for us from a procedural perspective to address power structures and access to participation and decision-making for these programs. A key to this is ensuring equitable, inclusive, and meaningful engagement, and asking, how does our engagement shift power, build trust, and ensure accountability, both structurally and intergenerationally, in the design and implementation of these programs? Later in the presentation, Carla will discuss how we worked with frontline organizations to co-design and implement some of our programming. And through elevating the historical context of discriminatory policies, present-day disproportionate climate impacts such as urban heat islands and energy burden, and identifying gaps in service for frontline communities such as renters, we began taking steps towards our goal of addressing the distribution of energy burden and efficiency benefits across different populations. When I was working at ERI, I heard Janet say many a time that you can't manage what you don't measure. For the energy equity programs, we knew that not only do you need an intentional strategy to make sure that locally and hardest hit parts of our community were the first in line for new opportunities, we knew we needed intentional objectives and metrics because inequities won't undo themselves. So in designing our objectives and measurables, we have made sure to capture both quantitative, qualitative, and spatial indicators that attend to the equity strategy I just described. Here is another map from the report I mentioned that outlines the number of multifamily buildings, again, at the census block level, to help us understand where do these renter needs concentrate in Cincinnati. And so we have taken steps to micro-target our services as best as possible to underserved and crisis communities, and to ensure that not only are we upgrading buildings, we are empowering residents and protecting affordability. Multifamily housing in particular is a tough nut to crack due to something called the split incentive. Tenants aren't incentivized to invest in their apartments because they don't own the unit. And landlords aren't incentivized to make the units more efficient because they're not paying the utility bills in most cases. So another layer to our programmatic strategy was ensuring that we provide programming to both renters and building owners. And with that, I'll pass it to Carla, who's going to dig in on our renter program.
Great. Thanks, Van. We launched our program for renters called Warm Up Cincy in February of this year. Eligible families are those who live in multifamily buildings, including duplexes for Cincinnati. In the city of Cincinnati, they must have the electricity bill in their name and have an income that is at or below 200% of the federal poverty limit. The box to the right kind of outlines the elements of the program where our incentive to participate for renters is a bill assistance of up to $500 for families who complete the education portion of our program, as well as the energy efficiency upgrades. Next slide. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about some of the important considerations for us in the development of the program. Number one, our partners. We needed to find a partner that already had a connection and a relationship with the targeted community, that was able to manage the income verification process that the city could not do, and had a bill assistance process already set up with our utility. Our county community action agency ticked all of those boxes, so we've been working with them from the very beginning. We needed another partner to manage the in-unit portion, someone to set up the upgrade appointments that had certified professionals who could conduct the energy assessments and also do the upgrades. A group called People Working Cooperatively ticked all of those boxes. Plus, they already had a very basic energy education packet of materials and a connection to our targeted community. Lastly, we needed a partner to help us create and then manage the education program. And we found that with a local partner called the Greater Cincinnati Energy Alliance, who had already had a history of working in neighborhoods on energy burden and education. Lastly, it's important in terms of building this that the city became a full partner as well. So our role included contract management and administration, but also quarterly reporting, data collection, creation, and management of program systems that track and monitor the participation of families and our partners. Now, when we launched this in February, we were looking at a 90-day pilot program with the goal to serve 65 families, with a mix of families who were in disconnect or getting ready to experience disconnect, and those who were not in experiencing disconnection. We and our partners understood that we needed to be flexible in the program implementation. So when issues arise, we actually discuss those options to responding to those issues during weekly team calls with our partners, and then we kind of push forward with an agreed upon pathway. I want to quickly highlight funding for our program and the program budget. And this is an issue for doing these programs because the funding isn't necessarily there. However, fortunately, the city of Cincinnati has funding through Duke Energy Ohio through a rate case settlement. The city receives 5 to 6 years of funding from Duke at $250,000 annually. Not a lot of money, but we try to do the most with it as possible. And for the tenant program, obviously each family receives up to $500 for their participation. And we're seeing that on average, the upgrades are somewhere around $500 per unit. The blue box there to the right gives you a few highlights in terms of the current status of the program participation, et cetera, and so forth. Next slide, please. So of course, no conversation in 2020 is complete without a hat tip to COVID-19. So I want to share a little bit about our experience in ensuring that the program continued to operate, especially during the pandemic. So one, like most utilities, Trevor spoke about this, Duke Energy Ohio had a moratorium on disconnects during most of the summer, which we absolutely applaud. However, what we did not anticipate was the behavioral response from potential program participants. A disconnect moratorium removed only one of the crises from these families' menus, and we recognized that they were dealing and juggling with a lot. And so while their focus was on dealing with other critical life issues, we saw that they were not necessarily as interested in joining and participating in a bill assistance program. So what we saw was a number of our referrals and participation took a dive. The impact on our partners. The people working cooperatively had a temporary stop work order from our Public Utilities Commission to do no activity inside homes or apartments, which meant we couldn't do any of the upgrades. And they were also seeing some disruptions in the supply chain in purchasing equipment and materials like air conditioners and refrigerators. For for the Community Action Agency responsible for any of our referrals, they ceased all in-person appointments and transitioned to work from home like most other organizations. And their processes needed to be transitioned to digital, and our materials were not. So we saw a disruption in referrals and the ability of our partner to actually bring families into the program. Our other partner, the education partner, became a casualty of the pandemic. They closed their doors in June, and we had to fold the education program into the operations of the city. We kept the program operating by separating our program elements. So now we try and do the education program and the upgrades in a parallel system. Now that the moratorium has ended and that people working cooperatively has revoked their cease order to operate and function in units. We've extended our pilot to the end of August, and we've worked with the Community Action Agency staff to transition all of our recruitment referral materials to an online digital process. And we're now seeing a lot more referrals come into the program. I'll end there and I'll flip it over back to Savannah to talk about our capital program.
Great, thank you, Carla. So just to wrap up with a few more numbers, wanted to point to this table from a recent report from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Building equipment for electric, water, and space heating are significant contributors to the energy burden of most vulnerable populations in the US, and specifically for the multifamily housing sector. So again, to attend to that split incentive and address building equipment, we have also developed programs for building owners to address whole building efficiency needs, not just in unit like our warm-up program does. Our recently launched small grants program provides a match of up to $5,000 for building owners to make envelope, so insulation and other related activities, appliance, lighting, hot water, or HVAC improvements. We also allow for additional proposals because of the variability we saw in the building stock analysis from University of Cincinnati. Our flagship program will be a significantly larger grant program, between $100,000 and $200,000 grant, with the goal of creating 1 to 2 case study buildings so that we gain a more granular understanding of what Cincinnati's high energy burden, low income multifamily building stock needs to become more affordable for residents. It will provide an ASHRAE Level 2 energy audit and financial support for high impact recommendations from the audit for, again, like I said, 1 to 2 buildings, with the goal of connecting with financing partners that we are in conversations with to hopefully extend this funding for years to come. We have intentionally designed the eligibility and funding preference criteria for these 2 programs to ensure that the city can prioritize delivering services to low-income buildings with the greatest need. Some of those criteria include high energy burden, mission and commitment to affordability, and more. We worked with the University of Cincinnati to design a program evaluation tool that displays block group information such as energy burden, median household income, et cetera, for a given building, and total annual estimated electricity savings for the proposed measures in their application. So through this tool, we are able to not only ensure that we're maximizing energy savings through our funds, but we are making sure that the funds are delivered to the applicants in the greatest need. We are also working to identify low-cost capital options for building owners who may want to layer financing on top of their grant in order to extend their upgrades even further. And one thing we just want to add about this whole, situation in Ohio in particular is that we are currently dealing with a state policy, House Bill 6, which some of you may or may not have heard of, that has rolled back our energy efficiency resource standards. And so it'll become crucial for Ohio cities moving forward to fill this gap that is going to occur as these standards are rolled back and currently provided energy efficiency services are rolled back from communities. And so that's it from us. Feel free to visit our energy equity website and reach out to us with any questions. Carla and I are always happy to chat about energy equity and excited to take your questions today.
Thanks to all of you. Those were great presentations, so substantive, so practical, and really illustrate how retail all of this is. If we're going to improve energy efficiency in this country and we're going to pay attention to people for whom the energy burden is the worst, it means getting into people's apartments. And Carla, I thought it was so interesting what you said about how interesting your program just completely or virtually tanked when the virus hit, and we can all appreciate that, right? I mean, people weren't working and they weren't going into people's homes, and goodness knows people had lots to think about other than, do I have enough insulation in my walls? That was probably pretty low down on their list. So now's the time for people's questions. I saw a couple came in, and I love the chat function. People jump in and just answer questions if they know the answer to them. Feel free to stick more questions in the chat. We also, I think, have a small enough group that if people want to unmute themselves and just pipe up, that's probably okay. Is that okay, Andrea? You can nod at me if that's okay. Andrea's nodding at me, so that's okay. I'll get us started while you guys are thinking of your questions, because I know it always takes a while for people to think of questions. So this question goes to our Cincinnati guests. So you have to deal with the amount of money that you have, the pressures that are on people, the constraints that are presented by the virus. Do you think that what are the biggest needs that you feel you have in order to really make this successful? And do you feel like you can actually take a good bite out of this challenge with the program that you have now?
You want to go, Sam?
We can tag team it.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, this is a very timely and question given the conversations happening in our office right now. As probably most folks on the line can appreciate, being a local government webinar, we are in an era of austerity, have been for a while, and capacity internally is always a tremendous challenge. And so, as Carla described, particularly with the impacts from COVID-19, our partners were disrupted. Our office was disrupted. We actually experienced one of the largest furloughs in the country, where thousands of city staff were furloughed for months. And Carla and I are, contractors in the office. And so we were able to keep this work going, but many of the staff we relied upon, they had to pause. And so, moving forward, I think the long-term sustainability of program management is always top of mind. local governments increasingly are relying on philanthropic dollars. We're relying currently on settlement dollars to deliver these programs, but this is an ongoing need. Energy crisis and disconnection is ongoing, and so I think developing sustainable financing for these programs, as well as ensuring that this is elevated within City Hall and prioritized to ensure permanent capacity to deliver on these programs. I don't know if you'd add anything else, Carla.
I'm nodding vigorously here. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the funding is always top of mind for me because there's no set plan after the case settlement ends, right? So we're looking at a program that's going to take place for the next 3 to 4 years, ideally. We need, and as I mentioned, $250,000 a year to do what we're doing is not a lot of money. I mean, even on the capital side, we're seeing maybe 1 to 2 flagship programs that are flagship case studies that we'll use, right? On the small grant side, we're looking at, $20,000, maybe $30,000 per round of capital grants for these small grant programs. It's not a lot when you look at the need, right? And if you think about the tenant side of this, if we're going to be seeing the country operate under a pandemic for the foreseeable future, at least let's say until the end of summer next year, we really need more dollars to provide these services for more families. And that's just something, that's a major challenge. Municipalities aren't seeing their, revenues go up. So, it's really kind of difficult to figure out what happens after 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify too that this might be a question for you, Trevor. So, you showed the map of how common it is or uncommon it is for states across the country to introduce utility shutoff bans, but that can be done at the city level too, I believe. So you can correct me on that or confirm. But once they turn that back on, I'm assuming that those bills have to be paid, and so the funding has to come from somewhere. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is extremely concerning, and there's been some, basically what we've seen for a lot of these utilities is like, okay, we'll work with the state who's doing a shut off, and we'll say that we're not going to have this like interest accrue on these bills, right? So if you don't pay them for 3 months, there's no interest. Well, coming out of a pandemic, if your bill is $400, after that period, after the moratorium expires, then you're still not in a good place, right? And I just want to this kind of surprised me. So I just want to note to people, we analyzed the average cost of reconnection in our second wave, and it was something like $200. So there's like a reconnection fee on top of what you have to pay just to get back on. So just to note that like once you get shut off, it's very, very difficult if you're a low income person, the reason that you got shut off in the first place to get back online. And so there are cities that have discretion to do this. I think another thing to note is just that there's these utility companies have a lot of power, and so I think that you would expect in some ways to see more cities go about and do this and say like, okay, the federal government's not doing this or the state government's not doing this, but we're going to step in and just go ahead and just not shut people off. But I would wager that the reason why you haven't seen more of that, even though you have seen some, is just because there's pressure from utility companies. These are always extremely powerful players, and also considered super important economic players. So oftentimes we don't see as much of that as we would like. But but like you said, like the important thing to note here is that cities can step up, and in all these states, which is soon to be a majority, that have decided that even though the pandemic is still raging and there's still high unemployment, that it's that the time to suspend these moratoriums is over. We should definitely be pushing cities to take all the actions they can to just say like, we're going to protect our citizens, and this is not a time to shut people off.
Yeah, and I think about this during COVID, but also about heat waves. Heat waves are not statewide typically, so they're much more local. And so I think it would be nice if we could develop some ways for our local governments to be like some partnerships with the utilities to make that utility bill suspension and shut off suspension happen more easily when so it can happen on the flip of a dime when it needs to, when a heat wave comes through.
So we've had a couple of questions come in from the chat. Thank you, people. Woodrow asks or says, Bloomington has a nonprofit called Indiana Solar for All that follows the Habitat for Humanity model of sweat equity, where low-income homeowners work side by side with community volunteers to learn how to weatherize buildings, focusing on the building envelope, and install small solar electric systems on their homes. And he's wondering whether you guys have heard of other communities that have a program like this, whether Cincinnati does perhaps, or other places in Ohio, or Trevor, whether you know of any.
Well, Cincinnati does have a habitat actively operating in the region, and I like that idea. We've not explored, although Savannah and I have had other conversations about how to expand and leverage the low-income multifamily energy efficiency program suites that we've been creating. How do we leverage that and expand it to addressing some of these other intersectional and the other connected issues that these families are dealing with, like workforce development, or further empowering those families to help them step themselves out of these situations. This is one of the reasons why we were so adamant about incorporating a substantial energy efficiency education program into the project, because we're talking about a population that is very transient. So they do move, and we want to make sure we didn't want the program to just be happening to them. We wanted to make sure that if they were moving to another location or another unit that may not necessarily have been upgraded, they know, after going through our education program, they know what to ask for. They know how themselves to set up an energy strategy for their family to help keep their bills low. But there's also this phenomena that we've been trying to tap into, also called the energy debt that these families carry with them. I'm gonna, Van, why don't you drop in a little bit about what that was, because that was a bit of a surprise to us.
Sure. Yeah, through our conversations with Community Action Agency, which is the partner who is not only doing the intake with energy crisis residents in our community, but they are also sort of the ones who are directing the financial assistance from our program to pay for those, reconnection fees that Trevor mentioned, as well as direct the financial assistance we provide to what is called an arrearage. And so these families are often carrying debt from month to month and are on the precipice of disconnection frequently. I think the last time we got numbers from our local utility, there were 3,000 plus residents that were experiencing disconnection. This was like in July. And so these are significant vulnerable numbers. And what we, in conversations with Community Action Agency, learned is that these arrears can be a matter of, $200, which our financial assistance can help clear. But some families are carrying $10,000 to $40,000 worth of debt. And so, that's insurmountable. And so I think, like Trevor said, working with utilities and with our state to kind of reimagine what does it mean to truly assist this population will be crucial. And to build on something Carla was describing with respect to kind of this, the question that Woodrow posed, our office is working with another partner called Groundwork Ohio River Valley, which is a great local organization. Groundwork is a national organization, but they have local chapters to build out an equitable engagement strategy for our Green Cincinnati plan. And a key component of their work is workforce development with youth. And they have Black and Brown leaders at every level of leadership. And those are the communities that they work with the most. And so we are excited to have conversations with them, how that relates to the energy efficiency work we described.
Just very, very quickly add, not directly related to this question, but I think one thing to note when we're talking about like efficiency in households is that we have the weatherization assistant program at the federal level, and it's dramatically underutilized. And we have a lot of really good research coming out to say that this is like the most low hanging fruit thing the federal government could do. This has been proven to be effective time and time again. So if I'm a policymaker at the federal level, I'm expanding weatherization assistance, and I'm pairing with state and local governments, and I mean, the return on investment is massive, and it's shown to have huge impacts of just, having people have, homes that have lower energy costs and are more sustainable.
And job creating in the community. My guess is that an incoming Biden administration is going to have their eye on that program for sure. So we have 3 great questions in the chat, and if we're efficient here with brisk answers, maybe 4. I saw one just came in. We can try to get through them all in the next 5 minutes. So Pat asks, was there, I think this is directed to the Cincinnati folks, was there any discussion with the local power company to continue service and increase rates to those ratepayers?
So we are in constant contact with the utility. The utility as a funder is also one of our partners, but we've not had conversations about increasing the rate. In the setup of the program, we've been kind of explaining to them how we want to make sure that we want to not just erase disconnect arrears, but we want to make sure that these families are set up to step themselves out of energy debt and step themselves out of energy burden.
Great. Edith asks, can anyone comment on the role of municipal government or community-based organizations in reaching low-income residents and delivering programs? What are the strengths and weaknesses of those 2 sectors? Great question.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, local government and community-based organizations we're working best in partnership for sure. For a host of reasons, some weaknesses as local government is that they're in government in general, sort of like a history that some communities, it's a difficult history, and there's a lack of trust between communities because of historical discriminatory practices, present day, discrimination that does happen. And so, recognizing that lack of trust is a barrier, and that we need to rebuild trust through community partners who are on the ground and able to work more closely than, city halls necessarily are able to, given sort of limited staff. And so I think it's key to build those very deep partnerships. And we've really enjoyed working with Community Action Agency and people working cooperatively on that front.
That's great, thanks. So here's a question from someone who is an affordable housing provider. Thank you, bless you for the work you do. How can we get data on the impacts of energy inefficiency to support funding requests? Another great question. Any suggestions? Trevor, is that something that the research you and others are doing can help provide data on?
I don't know if Savannah and Carla have sort of personal experience with this at the more micro level. I mean, obviously, but this is what our research is trying to do in part. So hopefully, people would be able to cite our research and saying clearly inefficiency in the home is something that's serious. And we're going to keep doing more. I just got an email this morning considering doing a project on efficient thermostats and thinking about conducting an experiment of households that have them and don't have them. So I would say that there's research being done by my team and a few other people. It's an emerging field in the scholarship. There's not enough right now. And so this is a problem that we're actively trying to solve. So hopefully, at all levels, from the federal government to cities, to providers can say like, this is a serious problem. And, the key being the return on investment is huge. If you make homes more efficient, I mean, it goes such a long way. So.
The only thing I would add is that Cincinnati and the programs that Savannah and I are creating, we'd be more than happy to serve as a case study for someone. I think we have a pretty decent record of some impact there.
There you go. Yeah. And it sounds like you guys are keeping really good data on your measurable things, metrics.
And I would also point you to the multifamily analysis, the housing analysis that we mentioned in our presentation. It is on our website. The sort of breakdown of looking at what are the factors that lead to lack of affordability with respect to energy and housing, that report outlines. And we're also happy to share, how we made requests to the utility to understand this more granular energy burden within our city at the neighborhood level and block level. And I think, individual building owners can also make these sort of data requests of their utility for the bills that they're responsible for. And you can also work with your tenants to, if they're willing to also disclose like their data through the utility to get a handle on, you can get up to 2 years of data. And through that information, you can sort of see what trends are. And there are ways, and our analyst at the University of Cincinnati, she's a buildings and architect engineer. She's working, on sort of parsing out, at least for the Cincinnati housing stock, basically guessing from energy use, like what types of measures would be most useful for those buildings.
Thank you, Savannah. I want to thank all of our three presenters. And I will say too, that if you're a listener, and especially the person who asked the question about data, if you can't remember the name of a particular researcher like Trevor, you can find research on these topics through Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. We track the research that's being produced by IU researchers on topics related to resilience. So you can always either find it on the website or you can contact Andrea or me. So I want to thank everybody. This was just a fantastic webinar. I really, really enjoyed it. I thought the questions were great. I want to thank the presenters again for their time. I want to thank the attendees for your time and for everything that you are all doing to try to address this really important societal issue that affects our neighbors and family members just so dramatically in a time of such stress for them. So I hope we'll see you back next month. Please spread the word. Andrea, anything else to tell people? Oh yes, Andrea, as she always does, will send a note out in a few days with links to the presentations, assuming that our presenters agree to let them out, and then also other resources that she knows about or comes upon that is relevant to this issue. So look for that from her. Anything else, Andrea?
We can wrap up. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you,
Have a
guys.
great day, everybody. Stay well and
Thanks,
safe.
Janet. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Trevor.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.